Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the Natural History Institute's lecture series. Before I introduce tonight's guest, I would like to make a few announcements. The Natural History Institute is proud to announce that we have published our first book, and it is The Woody Plants of the Mogollon Highlands. I believe one of the authors is here tonight, Carl Tomoff. Well, gosh, how do I get one of those books? I'm glad you asked. Next Thursday, we're going to have a book launch, and the authors will be here. They're going to give a little bit of a talk, and you'll be able to pick up the book there and also get a signed copy of it. So, encourage you to come out Thursday night to get your copy. The other announcement that I would like to make is that if you didn't have an opportunity to go into the gallery tonight, I recommend you do it after the talk, because we have a wonderful exhibition that began about 2 weeks ago, and the title of it's pretty crazy. It's the Biophilia Hypothesis Comes to the Periodic Table. And whenever you go in there and look at the exhibition, one of the things that the artist, Deborah Ford, is attempting to do is to bring our attention to the fact that bacteria and organisms like bacteria, archaea, are really running the whole show and have been doing so for a very, very long time. I'd like for you to think of us as just bacterial puppets. And so she had an opportunity to really drill into what is the color in those hot springs in Yellowstone, what causes those colors, what are those organisms, and what is chemosynthesis? And so I encourage you to go in there and check that out. The intention of the Institute is to integrate art, science, and humanities and human well-being in a revitalization of the practice of natural history. We always ask our visiting artists to conduct a workshop in the field. And so on January the 4th, we're going to have a workshop. Deborah Ford's going to have a workshop. It'll occur here mainly, but we will go into the field. And the title of the workshop is Seeing the Unseen. And so we're going to kind of delve into that world of macroinvertebrates, insects specifically, and other organisms. So if you're interested in that, you can sign up here, or you can sign up just by calling, and we'll be glad to take your information. That's January the 4th, which is a Saturday. Let's see. The heavy lifting. So most of you realize that it's coming towards the end of the year, and towards the end of the year, you get those endless requests for your money, fundraising. We are a not-for-profit, and I noticed that there are a number of faces in here of people who have come to a number of our programs. If you feel it in your heart to give to a young not-for-profit, well, this is a wonderful opportunity for you to do so. There's a little flyer out there on the table that you can pick up that can give you the information on how you can do that. There's also a jar out there. If you happen to have a loose 20 in your pocket, just drop it in that jar on your way out, and we'll be able to continue to give these programs. I think that's it. So natural history is a verb. It is the practice of intentional focused attentiveness to the more than human world, guided by honesty and accuracy. And natural history is the mother or the father of all natural sciences, including ecology. And in the world of ecology, there are some things that we like to be, as ecologists and scientists, we like to think are true until they're proven not true. And so tonight's talk kind of moves into that realm of looking at what is the relationship between biodiversity and climate change or climate variation. And so Matt Valente, our speaker tonight, is going to kind of take us into that world by visiting Cuatro Ciénegas in Chihuahua, Mexico, and he's done some research there. Now, Matt is familiar to us here at the Natural History Institute because he was the collections manager here for a while, so we were lucky to get to know him pretty well. And this guy is a remarkable human in many ways, and not the least of which, he's kind of the Swiss Army knife of college instructors. Do you need an instructor to teach biology? Matt.
Yeah.
You need an instructor to teach genetics? Matt. You need an instructor to teach botany, or maybe even how to manage collections? Matt. And maybe if you need an instructor to teach about Southern Appalachian music, or maybe play a few riffs of high lonesome music on his mandolin. That's Matt. So I'd like for you all to welcome Matt tonight.
Well, thank you, Bob, for that generous introduction. I'm very excited to be here, and thank you all so much for coming. Now, before I get started, there's a place that I'm pretty sure all of you probably heard of, the Galapagos Islands. Show of hands, how many people have heard of the Galapagos Islands? Nearly everybody. How many people have been to the Galapagos? More than your normal crowd. Well, I hope that through this journey today that we'll build some appreciation for a place that I think is equally as fascinating as the Galapagos, and that's Cuatro Ciénegas, Mexico. And I had the chance to travel there during my time in graduate school and develop a research project down there. And we'll be sharing a little bit about that. But first, I just wanted to orient you to the place and some of the incredible organisms that live there. So first of all, where are we? We're talking about a place kind of in the middle of nowhere of north central Mexico. You're never going to go there accidentally. It is about a 4-hour drive from the U.S. border. The nearest big city is Monterrey, Mexico. And it is a large valley surrounded by mountains. And in this valley is an assortment of habitats that are pretty rare in the desert, specifically aquatic environments. So we have wetlands, we have ponds, we have small rivers. And then there are also some other environments that are really interesting, like sand dunes that are made of gypsum, similar to White Sands, New Mexico. And all of these different environments harbor organisms that are not found anywhere else in the world. And as we go through this journey of what is known about Cuatro Ciénegas, I wanted to point out that this place has been very challenging to science. It has led to discoveries that have upended everything that we understood in a number of different fields. And so I want to go back to the earliest discovery there and acknowledge also some of the first people that would have encountered Cuatro Ciénegas, the Native Americans that would have lived there. And unfortunately, there's no written record of those people, but there are archaeological sites that have a rich history of what those people did to make their living, what they did to eat, how they made cordage, what their footwear looked like, and things like that. And early on in the 1930s, a talented young graduate student at Harvard named Walter Taylor was kind of got a lead on this place in Mexico where every little cave up in the mountains was a different and unexplored archaeological site. And so he spent a very long time down there collecting tens of thousands of artifacts from those caves through very meticulous excavations. Here's just a few pictures of some of those artifacts. They are all now housed in the Smithsonian's collection at the U.S. Museum of Natural History. And we have a few items here that are kind of important. There's a piece of cordage up there in the top left. There's a beaded necklace that was found in one of the sites in the bottom left. And what I wanted to focus on here is this thing in the middle. It looks like it's just a big mat of vegetation, but this is actually a piece of footwear, a sandal. And through his work there and his excavations, there were a few things that were found that were not what was expected due to the paradigm at the time for archaeology. First of all, he had records from these caves that were very deep. So he had very deep deposits of cultural artifacts. And the interesting thing was that some of the technology reflected in those didn't seem to have changed from the top to the bottom. And he decided to focus on these sandals as a source of information about these people and how they passed on information between generations. And remarkably, he found at the very top of the deposits the same technology being used and the same patterns of weaving to make those sandals as was found at the bottom, which suggested that maybe this didn't reflect that long of a period of time. But then he got his first radiocarbon dates back from these sites. They were the oldest radiocarbon dates known for a human site in North America at the time. And that was not supposed to have happened. And I wanted to also point out that these people didn't always wear sandals, because there is the oldest human trackway that has been found in North America, over 10,000, close to 11,000 years old. And you can see all these footprints from people that would have been walking along this kind of muddy shore of maybe a lake environment. And these have also given us some information about the environment at the time. It seems like it might have been a little wetter then. So what did Walter Taylor do with all this information? Did he just kind of forget about it and try not to make waves? No, he's not that kind of person. So he, instead of publishing his results of the analysis of all of those sandals and various other things in these sites, he wrote a critical review of the field of archaeology at the time, and was very critical of all of the really important archaeologists at the time, which is not great career advice. He was never able to attain an academic position after that. However, today, you should know that every graduate student in archaeology reads this dissertation. So some incredible discoveries that led to advances in science that took a while to be appreciated. So next, I wanted to move to the biology side of things and talk about another scientist, W.L. Mink Lee, who's affectionately known as Mink to his graduate students and those that knew him. He's the gentleman on the right. As a young man, one of his first visits to Cuatro Ciénegas. He was a professor at ASU eventually, down in Phoenix or Tempe, and he went down there the first time because he'd heard these reports of a box turtle that lives in the water, which any of you that have grown up or lived anywhere where there were box turtles commonly, that's not something they do. They walk around in the woods. And he showed up, and here we have box turtles swimming around in these ponds. And this is just one of the 3 species of turtles that occur in Cuatro Ciénegas that are found nowhere else on the planet. And this kind of kicked off a rapid succession of discoveries of plants and animals that were discovered that lived nowhere else. And through his work, and he brought some friends from the Desert Botanical Museum down in Phoenix, and some folks from the University of Texas. They made a lot of collections and found, on top of that, there's 8 endemic fish species. The one on the bottom left is named after Dr. Mink Lee. It's Herichthys minklii. It's actually a cichlid, which is more of a tropical species. And we see through all of these different examples across the tree of life, we find things that are kind of like at the northern end of the tropical realm or the southern end of the temperate realm, and also things from the east that are finding a place there at the far western end of their range or the far eastern end of a western species range. Another good example, I can't do this talk without talking about a plant. What does that plant look like to most of you? Ocotillo. It's not an ocotillo. It is the same genus, but it is Fuchsiaria shrievi, which is a different endemic species of ocotillo-like plants. On top of this, Now there are dozens of snails, and all put together about 150 species of endemic plants and animals. The most recent explosion of information about the incredible biodiversity in this place has come from a new area, which I'm really glad Bob kind of introed this, because we're going to go back to the archaea and the bacteria. And what I wanted to mention about this particular slide is this is at one of the ponds, and it's one of the several ponds that are known as Poza Azul. And it has this really incredible structure around its edges. And this is actually a stromatolite reef. Now, stromatolites are something that we don't think of as being part of the ecology on this earth in a significant way any longer, but they were once the most important form on earth for billions of years. And they're mostly made of bacteria. Also, there's some archaea and diatoms and other algae. They live together, and they slowly build up this crust of minerals as they kind of grow out into the waterway. And they come in many, many different shapes and forms in Cuatro Ciénegas. This one kind of has a cauliflower, coral reef type look if you look at it from underwater, which I had the fortune to be able to do. So in comes Dr. Valaria Souza. She is a professor at the National University in Mexico City, and in the early 2000s, she made another just groundbreaking discovery. She was able to look at some of these ponds, and there's many different types in the valley. Some of them are crystal clear freshwater. Some of them are really salty because they're out in places where the water gets there and then it evaporates. Some of them actually are geothermal. They're warm pools. And the first look that she had there found over 200 new species of bacteria that were not known to exist anywhere else on the planet. And it wasn't like they were just all coming from, like there's one small group that may have had a radiation in that area, and maybe they're all closely related species. They come from all across the tree of life of bacteria. And so here, all of the places where you see a blue line, those are endemic Cuatro Ciénegas species of bacteria in the entirety of, this is one particular genus of bacteria. Now these lineages of bacteria and archaea go back billions of years. And some of these are far more distantly related to each other than, say, we are to them. And the origin of many of these lineages of bacteria in Cuatro Ciénegas seem to go back millions and millions of years, such that some of them seem to have diverged from all the rest of the known bacteria on the planet for 50 million, 100 million, maybe even longer, that many years. So all of this put together has made Cuatro Ciénegas a premier natural laboratory for studying ecology and evolution. It's even been, and actually I put this number on here because every time I do a talk about this, I go to Google Scholar and I type in Cuatro Ciénegas and I see how many papers mention it. And right now, I looked at it this morning, it was like 7,210 or something. There's that much interest in this place. Because of this incredible biodiversity of bacteria and archaea, it's also been thought of as a potential analog for life that would have been in the early environments of the planet Earth, say Precambrian times, or what might have existed on other planets at some time in the past or potentially in the present. And the elemental makeup of the water there actually is part of this. And these environments tend to be very low in phosphorus, which is one of those key nutrients for life, but it's not stifling biodiversity in this place. Okay, so then the question arises, how did all of this stuff get here? What processes allowed it to exist to this day? And one of the main hypotheses that has been put forward is that somehow this place has been an island of stability with habitats that have existed for an extremely long time in a kind of sea of change and different environments that these organisms wouldn't necessarily be able to traverse. And so it's really important to understand the history of this place in an environmental sense. And people tried to start figuring that out very early on. And so obviously one of the things that you were going to be looking at is water and what has happened to the amounts of water and the levels of groundwater and things like that throughout time. Because most of these species that are endemic to the Cuatro Ciénegas Basin are in some way tied to the water. They're tied to these aquatic environments. Okay, so where does this water come from? So I have a kind of simple geologic map here. And most of the water, obviously, it comes from the sky first. And then it rains in the mountains surrounding the area. And the topographic position of the valley itself it's kind of the lowest spot in a very large area of north central Mexico. And so all the groundwater from that much larger region kind of feeds down into the valley in a subterranean manner and comes out in these springs. And so on one side of the valley, over here, we have some faults and fractures that are helping guide that water from a very large regional source to the surface. And those are expected to change less frequently with climatic fluctuations because they may respond to climate changes on the order of tens of thousands of years instead of on an annual basis. In the middle of the valley, there's this mountain called the Sierra San Marcos, and there's a zone of springs on the eastern side of the Sierra San Marcos. There's hundreds of these springs. And some preliminary work showed that the water that's coming from these springs is more coming from rainfall on the top of this mountain locally than from the regional aquifer. And so in thinking about a place to capture the environmental changes that are occurring locally, this is probably a better spot to look. So what are some good sources of paleoenvironmental information? Well, many have been developed over the years, and a lot of them come from sediment cores, where you go and you collect a cylinder of sediment from a place and you analyze it for various things, maybe pollen, maybe isotopes, geochemistry, and things like that to infer what the environment has been like in the past. Also, pack rat middens in the desert Southwest have been a very important source of paleoenvironmental information. They have plants. You can radiocarbon date them and see what's in the general area that pack rat lived its life and made its midden. However, these are typically only up in the mountains and not on valley floors. You typically don't find 10,000-year-old pack rat middens on a valley floor. And that's really what the question is here. So like, what's happening on the floor of this valley where all these aquatic habitats are? And then also the archaeological sites from those excavations of Walter Taylor, and I've flipped through probably 5,000 pictures on the Smithsonian's website because they're now all online. There are things that are found in those archaeological sites that are not there today. There are hickory nuts. There are no hickory trees there today. There are walnuts, and I'm not talking like the little Arizona walnuts. There are like big walnuts in there. And these are all things that kind of hint at maybe a more wet climate at some point in time in the past when people were there. However, people like to move things around, and you never know if those were traded with somebody from hundreds of miles away, or if they came from that area. Also, dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, can tell us a lot about climate in the past. However, there are not very many trees on the valley floor, and they also don't live that long. And again, if we're looking at trees that are living on the mountains and we're trying to infer something about that, that doesn't necessarily tell us what's happening on the valley floor, and it probably only goes back a few hundred, at most a few thousand years. So the first study of the sediments in Cuatro Ciénegas. It was also done by an ASU graduate student, Meyer, who concluded a few things that have kind of supported this hypothesis that this is a unique place that has not changed very much, where we know the rest of the continent, or the world really, has experienced huge fluctuations in climate over the last 20,000 years. And there might have been a few issues. This was very early in the study of sediment cores using radiocarbon dating, and there's some potential complications with the types of sediments that you find in a desert southwest wetland, including lots of carbonate that comes from the geologic formations. It's very old and can skew the results. So what we decided to do, after some talks with the folks down there, was to try to find a place that we could collect a new sediment core that we could kind of analyze with modern techniques and test this hypothesis, if this area has been stable for that whole period of time, or if things have changed a lot. So this is the site that we got our best sediment core from. This was a very hot day in June, by the way. And we called it Poza Cortador for the Spanish name for the plant that is primarily found here, which is sawgrass. And this is the Sierra San Marcos up here, and you can see that there's maybe some precipitation going on at the top, and hopefully that water is trickling down through this mountain down into the alluvial fan, into the groundwater here, and then it comes out in this little wetland marsh. You could call that a ciénaga today, but we called it Poza Cortador, which means a pool or pond, because we thought that that's what it used to be. We thought that it used to have been a pond, and the reason we thought that was because in that region there are hundreds of these circular ponds. This is the one I showed you before that has the stromatolite reef on it. And we were just upstream, so we were trying to find, or upslope, we were trying to find a site that maybe used to be one of these large ponds that has filled in over time with sediment, and we're just catching it at the last moment before it just blends in with the rest of the desert in the valley floor. So how do you get a sediment core from a place like this? Well, you do it slowly, 1 meter at a time. And this is us with our coring device. That's a younger version of me. And Chad Lane here, and then Andres Nahara Diaz, who is a researcher in northern Mexico. And you just go 1 meter at a time. The core itself looks like this. It consists of a 2-inch in diameter metal tube with a piston that goes inside of it that you can keep locked into the bottom of the core until you get to the depth at which you want to start sampling again. And so you can sample below that. And then each time you get a new meter of sediment, you squeeze it out into a cradle of PVC pipe, aluminum foil, and saran wrap, and you wrap it up. You take very detailed notes, and then you start the long process of getting it back to the United States, which is another talk all in itself. So we were actually very fortunate at this site, and we were able to get a sediment core that went down 14 meters. So that's quite a distance. You can see here, this was towards one of the last sections. It wasn't the final section of sediment that we got. And I was told never to show this picture to my advisor, because we left all the coring rods on and there's the handle, that's where we started. So that's how far down we were in the sediments. And after a long day of collecting sediment cores, there has to be victory guacamole at the end of the day. And you see here all of these tubes, all of those are approximately a meter of sediment, all wrapped up. It was about 180 pounds of sediment altogether. And brought them back to the lab at the University of Tennessee, and started developing our research questions and processing the samples. So there were two main questions to start out. By looking at these cores and the types of sediments that are in them, does that support a hypothesis where the hydrology has changed a lot over time, or has it been the same? Has it been stable? And if it has changed a lot, do these changes correspond to other known changes in the global or regional climate? Because if we can link the climate of Cuatro Ciénegas to the global or regional patterns, that says something about the future. And that says that in the future, we could probably expect it to also be responding in similar ways to the rest of the environment in the region. And so the types of data that we collected were the type of sediment itself, and you can tell some really interesting things just by looking at the sediments and seeing what they're made of, whether it's mainly peat, just all organic matter, or maybe it has, it's all like crusty and dried out and there's like traces of roots going through it. That's a good indicator that it probably dried out and there were plants living on top of it. We also looked at some of the shells of snails, mollusks that we found in there, and also we found some fish bones and things like that. And then radiocarbon dates to tell you how old the sediments are. And so the first thing we had to do was cut these sediment cores in half, long ways, take super high resolution pictures of them, and look at what was in there. And here's just this example of all the animal fossils that we were finding. Nearly all of these snails are also endemic and only found in the Cuatro Ciénegas Valley. And an interesting thing we found was that most of these were present all the way throughout the core. There didn't seem to be any huge changes in the snail species that were found from the bottom to the top. And then for the radiocarbon dating, actually, we can't leave the other big university in the state out, so I went to the University of Arizona and their accelerator mass spectrometry lab, and they have this huge particle accelerator, and they can count carbon atoms, and they can separate out different isotopes of carbon atoms and count them. It takes an enormous amount of electricity in a huge room, but we were able to get over 15 radiocarbon dates that told us something about the age of those sediments. And so when you put all this together, you might have something that looks like this. You have your picture of the core alongside a sediment type determination based on these various things that you found. And then you can make a inference about what was going on during that time that those sediments were deposited. And here we have a section that's all peat. It's just really dense plant material. And so during that time, we know from this site and from many other sites, that was likely a marsh system covered with like the sawgrass and cattails and things like that. But then we have this very mineral-rich area with root traces in it, and that is a very clear indication that the surface of this marsh dried out and other woody vegetation moved in. And so that's pretty good evidence of maybe a drying event. And also, a lot of times when you look at something like this and you look at the radiocarbon age here and the age here, this will oftentimes represent hundreds of years of drought conditions. And so what did our results look like when you put all this together? Well, our earliest radiocarbon dates showed us that this 14-meter sediment core represented almost 14,000 years of history in this place. And I'll just real quick talk about these different zones. So I have blue zones, green zones, and brown zones. And the blue zones are zones where the sediments are what you would expect to find if that particular site where we took the core was underwater. And so it wasn't a marsh, it was actually underwater. And there's oftentimes lots of snail shells and algae bits and fine sediments. And then we have many different regions with evidence of drying events where the surface of this site would have dried out. So that's pretty good evidence that stability doesn't really fit here. And if you look at some of these major Paleosol periods, especially this one about 3,000 to 2,000 years ago, and then another one in 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. These are both known drought periods in the desert Southwest. These are some of the hottest and driest periods that we know until some of the recent changes that we've seen for that whole 14,000 year period. And so I wanted to take a step back and talk about those turtles again and fire. And this kind of goes back to the whole reason we initially were invited to come down to Cuatro Ciénegas. And the lab that I was working in did a lot of fire reconstruction using sediments. And the folks there were curious about the role of fire in the maintenance of these habitats. And we know now that a lot of places in the Southwest, fire has been excluded to the detriment of many, many plants and animals. And so they did a test burn. They did a prescribed burn as an experiment. And unfortunately, many turtles perished in the experiment because they were walking around in the marsh area. That was not good. These are kind of their flagship species for conservation. And a lot of people love these turtles. And that was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. No fires, period, where there are these turtles. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that eventually there wouldn't have been more turtles than there were before. Just the visual of all these dead turtles was enough to shut this down. So where do you go to get more information? You can go to the sediments and say like, well, these turtles have been here for thousands of years. Have there been fires for that whole time? So for this analysis of fire, we looked to charcoal that was found in the sediment cores. And here's our little sampling device. You take about 2 cubic centimeters of sediment, and then you have to disaggregate them. You have to get them to break apart because we're looking for really small pieces of charcoal. And so you boil them in sodium hydroxide, which helps break up all of the organic matter, but it leaves those pieces of charcoal that are actually pretty resilient chemically. And then you have to put them through a sieve because you're trying to find certain size particles. And then, unfortunately, what's left, a lot of it looks like charcoal, but isn't really charcoal. And if you put them in hydrogen peroxide for overnight, the ones that are not actually charcoal will turn clear, and the ones that are actually charcoal will stay black and shiny, like charcoal should be. And then you count, and you count, and you count. And a graduate student in our lab, John Eads, finished his master's thesis counting, and I believe he counted over 1 million pieces of charcoal over the course of 2 years. Yes, and he survived. So what does the record look like? When we look at the age of the sediments and the amount of charcoal that we find in them, do we see evidence of a lot of fires in the past? Or do we see no fires? And not surprisingly, we found evidence of a lot of fires. And so what you're looking at here are the charcoal particles that were found in that sample. And then this is the approximate age of those sediments. So in the last, let's say in a 1,000-year period, there's over 30 peaks of charcoal, and each one of these peaks represents a fire event. And with this high of amounts of charcoal, some of these are way higher than you would find in lake sediments. And these reflect, we think, fires at that site. Like the fire burned right over where we took our sediment core, over 30 times in that 1,000 years. Clearly, fire has a role in the environment here. And the reason this is also important is they have some invasive plant species that have invaded the aquatic habitats there that are heavier users of water than a lot of the native plant species. And because of that, they can lower the levels of groundwater and lower the amount of water that's available for other species through their growth. And one of the tools that's been used to manage them in other places is fire. And so this kind of helps show that fire is an important part of this ecosystem. Okay, so what did all of this together? What do we find? So the results from the sediments, results from the charcoal, all show that there has been incredible variability in climate and in other environmental conditions in this time period over the last 14,000 years. The timing of a lot of those changes seem to be in lockstep with all of the other known changes in the regional or global climate. And that shows us that this place, with all this incredible biodiversity, is likely to continue to respond to regional and global climate changes. And given what was predicted in the desert Southwest, hotter, drier climates, these will have very important implications for the conservation of this oasis of biodiversity going into the future. And so there's some really important things to think about. Okay, so there's a lot of people I have to thank. All this research involved many, many, many people, especially Sally Horn and Tom Mink Lee, who were advisors on the project, a number of students, funding from the National Science Foundation and the University of Tennessee, and the Nature Conservancy actually owns the property that we were collecting our samples on, and they helped fund it. So last, I wanted to say something about the snails, and it was really interesting to me. I did not expect that the same assemblage of snail species would have been found over 14,000 years at that one site. Even through all of these changes, it drying out, getting wet again. This is not really what I expect. So I think this speaks to some resiliency, because I don't want to end on a dire note. I think I want to end on a little bit of a hopeful note, that this resiliency is still there with these organisms, and with enough help and care, we can get them through the next several million years in Cuatro Ciénegas. So, right. All right. Well, thank you for your attention, and be happy to take some questions from the audience. And thanks again. Okay, back here. Yes.
Let me go back to one of the first kind of questions that you raised.
Uh-huh.
You said there was a hypothesis that had been floated that said, maybe the climate was more stable here, or at least the aquatic regime was more stable.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, what you've shown tonight, seems to throw that hypothesis out.
Yes.
What sorts of hypotheses are you looking at now that help to explain that tremendous stability and a high level of endemic species?
Right. So one of the things I haven't mentioned is that many of the valleys surrounding Cuatro Ciénegas used to hold aquatic habitats. They no longer do. And the reason that many of them no longer do is that early in the colonial period, they were farmed heavily. And Cuatro Ciénegas was unique amongst those valleys in that the colonial settlers were never able to get a permanent settlement in the Cuatro Ciénegas Valley until 1810. And at that time, the colonial agricultural system was kind of ending in Mexico when they became independent from Spain shortly after that, and the system of farming was very different. So I think what we possibly have here is an assemblage of organisms that at one point in time had a vastly larger area to inhabit and for them to survive in over these changes over millions of years, and that more recently Cuatro Ciénegas has become very special because it still has water where these other places don't. So that's one of my ideas. Yeah, so I would love to go down there and take sediment cores from a lot of the valleys around there. That's something that probably will need to be done by a researcher that's more local, that has access to those sites. I personally don't really have the mechanism to do that at this time, but I think that some of the folks in northern Mexico at their universities and also in the National University are starting to look into some of those questions. Yeah. Yes?
What are the general elevations of these mountains and,
Yep.
and the valleys? Elevation has so much to do.
It does. Yes. Okay, yes. So the question was, what are the relative elevations of the valley floor and the mountains that are surrounding there? So the mountains, or the valley floor itself is around 800 feet in elevation. So it's pretty low for this region. And the mountains themselves go up to close to 10,000 feet. So there's this incredible difference there. And if you go up on the mountains, there's Douglas fir, and there's not ponderosa pine, but there's something that looks like ponderosa pine. There's actually an endemic spruce tree that lives up there, and things like that. Yes?
Now that you've given us this beautiful travel log, we're all going to go down there visit this place. How are they protecting this area?
That's a great question. So the question was about what protections does the area have now? And you can pretty much run through the whole list of the accolades that a place can get, and Cuatro Ciénegas has it. First of all, the protections come from the Mexican government as a protected area of flora and fauna. I think that's the translation, which is kind of like a national park designation where they monitor and they look at all these different organisms. There's been concern about groundwater extraction in the surrounding valleys, and many of them, if you look at them on Google Earth, you see these green circles, and they're basically just pumping groundwater up and they're growing alfalfa to feed the cows. And that is a big concern because they're concerned that that's going to affect the hydrology in the valley. Of course, the ranchers and the miners argue that they're not connected, but I think the evidence shows that otherwise. Also, it's a UNESCO World Biosphere Reserve. It is, there's this really cool designation in Mexico for cities called Pueblos Mágicos, which are magic cities. And Cuatro Ciénegas, the city, which is a small town, it's beautiful, has been designated one of those. And so there are some really good protections in place. And the particular site where we were collecting these sediment cores is in a conservation, it's a property that's actually owned by the Nature Conservancy because it has so many places. They bought it several years ago. It used to be a ranch. Other questions? Yes?
So you first talked about the archaeologists,
Mhm.
and I can't remember the times, but what's the connection between when there's evidence of humans being there,
Mhm.
and any of your borings? Was
Right.
there any connection between that?
Yes, so the oldest radiocarbon dates and the footprints that are from the Cuatro Ciénegas area are in the realm of 11,000, maybe a little bit older. When I was down there, I did see a private collection of arrowheads that had some points that were indicative of maybe an older introduction there, maybe 13,000 years ago. And so that period of occupation by those folks lasted from then until about 500 years ago, when either disease or climate change or politics or whatever, people seem to have abandoned those cave dwellings that had been occupied for over 10,000 years. And so we see about that time actually a decline in fire, which is interesting. So maybe people were using fire as a tool for maintaining some of these habitats for other things, like maybe hunting or something. And we see that all over. When people show up to a place, fire tends to go up until this most recent odd period where we've just been putting fires out everywhere. So yeah. Yes?
Are there currently folks that live in this area?
I am not aware of any in that valley itself of Native American folks. It's mostly descendants of the first Mexican settlers that came in the early 1800s. There's no connection, as far as I can tell, between the people that were there then and a direct, like, oral tradition to the people that live there now. I've asked a lot, but nobody's been able to point me in the right direction. Oh yeah, there's similarities for sure between ones there and also in the Rio Grande region, in the on the Texas border. There's been some similarities for sure, and there's whole papers about similarities in the way people made sandals and things. So I think there was a regional culture for sure during that time, and I think a lot of the archaeological work points to that. Yes?
This Walter Taylor,
Uh-huh.
he couldn't get an appointment at a university, maybe
Yeah.
after he was writing this archaeological
Uh-huh.
tract. So what did he do, just go down there and live? Or
Nope, he actually went to, he became a curator at a museum. And he worked with the collections at a museum for his entire career. And eventually when he retired, he returned to a lot of those artifacts that he had collected and finished his papers analyzing those sandals and quids that people had chewed on and spit out, various other things that he was very interested in. And he was a big proponent for modern science in archaeology. He thought there was a lot of speculation and hand waving, and he was a big proponent of data. And so he measured all kinds of things that he had to invent metrics for, to measure these sandals and use statistics to analyze them in that way. And that was his legacy and the mark that he left on archaeology. Yes?
Let me go back to the first images.
Sure.
I think you said it was stromatolites, freshwater stromatolites?
That is correct.
What are those made from? Is that mostly calcium or?
So I'll show you two different types. It's mostly calcium carbonate. It's mostly what it's made of. The other thing that it's made of is silica. There's a lot of diatom bodies in there, actually. So it's not an individual organism, it's a community. It's in a sense, but it's mostly, corals typically are a specific group of animals, and there's no, as far as I know, no animals involved in this. There are algae, there are bacteria, there might even be some fungi, and then there are the diatoms that are in there. And I forgot to mention in this picture of Dr. Souza, in the back here, you see these little alien-looking things? Well, this paper just came out last week as a preprint, and I was reading it, and these are called Archaean domes. And this particular pool is usually dry, but there was a heavy rain event, and after it rained, they started seeing these things kind of growing. And so, of course, she sent some graduate students to take some samples, and they took some cross-sections of this, and they looked at the genetics, because that's the way you identify archaea, usually, is you look at a particular gene, and then you look at the sequences for that gene for all the individuals there, and you can kind of figure out how many people, archaea, are there. And this site, after this rainstorm, had over 230 species of archaea, which is far more than anywhere else known on the planet, just from this pond. And this is just even this week, there's these incredible new discoveries from this place, and I'm sure that there's many more to come out of, especially her lab.